There we go. That'll work. We will start with the first two. The first two are prefixes, and they should be fairly easy. See if you know what they mean. Homo and hetero. What do you guys think those mean? Which one, Angelina? Yes, Jacob. Homo means same. And then hetero would be opposite, which is what? Different. Good. Or opposite. That's fine too. Yep. And dominant and recessive. Do we know, have a couple synonyms for those? So homo means same, hetero means different.
For dominant, I put in power, and recessive, I put controlled.
Controlled, like ED. That works. Dominant is more powerful. Strong, yes. So then the opposite of strong would be more weak or being controlled. So that's fine. Good. All right. So this picture, kind of draw and label it. What's number one? What are these X-shaped things called? Chromosomes. Good, Jacob. What about number two? What's the little squiggly? Chromosomes are made of what? DNA. Yep, good. And then a piece of DNA, number three, is referring to like a chunk of the DNA. Gene. Good, Angelina. Yep. So one, the whole thing is a chromosome. It is made up of number two, DNA, and then DNA is broken up into chunks, which are genes. Very good. All right, really quickly, I'm going to go over this. You don't have to write this down. This is just about the discussion last week. So I was reading everybody's responses to the discussion in the at-home DNA kits. A lot of people are under the impression that it's only for like paternity and determining your ancestors. That's not all it's for. It's more than that. If you get your DNA sequenced, they can also determine whether you have the genes to potentially develop certain disorders. And the disorders, sometimes you can pass them on to your children. Is that something you would or wouldn't want to know? They can also determine drug sensitivity. We talk a lot about it in one of my dual enrollment college classes. When you're a junior or a senior, you guys can take those. But they can also determine if you're sensitive to certain antibiotics, if you're sensitive to certain cancer drugs, even if you're sensitive to nicotine. Some people are more susceptible to nicotine and becoming smokers than other people, and it has to do with their DNA. So it's not just about paternity or determining relatives. Hi, Alex. It determines a lot of different things, your DNA does. So I don't know if that changes your mind about the DNA kits. Make sure you're responding to your classmates. Some of you only got partial credit because you didn't respond to your classmates. That's still open for you to do if you need to, but moving on. Essential question, how are traits passed through generations? Same essential question that we've been talking about for the past few weeks. So DNA makes up genes, which make up chromosomes. So there's the same picture that you guys saw in the bell work. The whole X is a chromosome, then you have DNA, and then a piece of DNA is a gene. And then on the left, the pictures, if you're looking at the chromosomes, whether it's singular or duplicated, you have colorful bands on it. When you guys did karyotyping, you matched the bands up, and each one of those bands is a different gene. So to review, DNA is a basic unit of heredity. A gene is a whole piece of DNA. And a chromosome is made of many different genes. That's just kind of some background information. Gene. Some vocabulary words that you've had on your attendance quizzes, or you will have on your attendance quizzes. DNA, gene, chromosome. If you're looking at the duplicated chromosome, it usually has bands on it, in each colored band. or black and white band in the case of when we did our karyotypes. Each one is a gene. We are in week 6 this week. These are our 6.4 notes. I opened both week 6 and 7 if you wanted to get ahead on work. And I just lost it. Let's try that again. All right, genes. Each gene has a specific location on a pair of homologous chromosomes. These are off. There we go. So you have homologous chromosomes. Each chromosome has a little yellow band on it. And at the same location, that is the location of the gene that controls eye color. There can be many different versions of the same gene. The different versions are called alleles. It's a word we went over last week. Alleles. And if we have 2 alleles, where do you guys think we get each of our alleles? Who do we get them from? Who do we get everything from? Mother and father. Good. We get one from mom, one from dad. Good. Jacob, Angelina, Angel. Yep. Phenotype. So here's a few more vocabulary words you need to know for your quiz this week. So a phenotype is a physical expression of a trait or the things we can see about ourselves. So examples include things like eye color, hair color, height, hair texture, skin color. So when you hear the word phenotype, you always think of physical characteristics. Not to be confused with genotype. Genotype refers to a pair of alleles. We have different genotypes for all of our traits. So when you hear the word genotype, you think of your genes, what is inside your cells. So phenotype is what's on the outside, the physical characteristics. Genotype is what's on the inside of our cells, the different alleles we get from mom and dad. Dominant versus recessive. So we already said dominant is the stronger one, the more controlling, and then recessive is kind of the weaker one, it gets controlled. So alleles, like I said, we have 2, one from each parent. They can either be dominant or recessive. A dominant allele will always show. A recessive allele will be masked when paired with a dominant allele. A recessive allele will only be shown if there are 2 copies in the genotype. So for our typical example, we always talk about eye color. Brown eyes are dominant to blue eyes. If a brown-eyed person gets together and has a child with a blue-eyed person, brown eyes are dominant. The brown eyes is going to mask the blue-eyed allele, and the child is going to come out with brown eyes. It's a little more complicated than this, but this is your first foray into genetics. And Punnett squares, dominant recessive, homozygous heterozygous. So we like to simplify it at first as much as we can so you can learn it. We're going to do a few examples in a minute and let you guess, dominant or recessive, which one is going to win out. On paper, genotypes are represented by letters, and they're always the same letters. So the dominant genotype, we use capital letters. So for brown eyes, which is the dominant trait, we would use a capital B. The recessive genotype, we use lowercase letters. So for blue eyes, we would use a lowercase b. Genotypes are made of two alleles, one from mom, one from dad. When we pair them together, we can call them either homozygous or heterozygous, which is why it's useful to know the definition of the prefixes homo and hetero. So if the alleles, the two alleles in a person's genotype are the same, we call it homozygous. Now they can either both be dominant, both uppercase, or both be recessive, both lowercase, but either way, they're the same version of the same allele. That's where the homo comes in. On the opposite side, you have heterozygous, which it's the same letter, but they're different versions of that letter. One big A, one small a. And we can use any letters. You'll be using lots of different letters. But if they're the same version, they're homozygous. If they're two different versions, one big, one small, they are heterozygous. So it's very important to remember when a question asks for a genotype, the answer is going to be two of the same letters. The only difference is whether it's capital or lowercase. We are going to do a couple of poll questions practicing this, because this is how the questions are going to be on your quiz this week. So the first has to do with homozygous versus heterozygous. So number one, you have two capital Z's. What is that? Would you call that a homozygous genotype or a heterozygous genotype? Number two, you have one big Y, one small y. And then number three, you have two small e's. So classify all those genotypes into either the homozygous category or the heterozygous category. And all you have to do is remember what the prefixes mean. What does homo mean? What does hetero mean? I'll give you about 10 more seconds to answer if you have not already. All right. So most of you got them right. So big Z, are those two of the same letters or are those two different letters? What do you guys think? Someone tell me. Number one, big Z, big Z. Same, good. Jacob, Angel, those are the same. The prefix homo means same, so therefore that is a homozygous genotype. What about the second one? Big Y, small y. Are those the same or different? Different, good. Yep. Hetero means different, therefore that is a heterozygous genotype. And then last one, small e, same, yep. So that is a homozygous genotype. So most of you got those right. If you did not get those right, that's okay, but this is why we're doing this, to learn, correct your mistakes so you can do well on the quiz later this week. All right, next is dominant versus recessive. And I will go back to this slide. So if a person has a genotype, capital A, which allele will be shown as the phenotype or the physical trait? The dominant one or the recessive one? Number two is if the person has two lowercase a's in their genotype, what will be shown? And then number three is one of each. If a person has one capital A and one small a, what happens? Which physical trait is shown, the dominant one or the recessive one? And I went back to the slide if you need to review dominant versus recessive. Most of you have dominant versus recessive down, but you're a little bit shaky on the heterozygous. If you have a big A and a small a, which one gets shown? Maybe about 10 more seconds. All right, most of you got them right. Number one, if a person has capital A, it's all dominant. The dominant one is the only one you have. The dominant is the only thing you're gonna see. And then for number two, the same is true for recessive. If you only have the recessive allele, the recessive phenotype is the only thing you're gonna be able to see. And then number three, if a person has one of each, that dominant allele is going to mask the smaller, weaker recessive one. So you will always see whatever the dominant trait is. All right, last one, we are going to apply that to an actual situation. So brown eyes is dominant to blue eyes. If a person has a genotype, capital B, what color will their eyes be? On the opposite side, number two, if a person has two small b's, what color will their eyes be? And then number three, if a person has a heterozygous genotype, one of each letter, one big B, one small b, what color will their eyes be? I'll give you guys about 10 more seconds. Most of you are doing just fine on picking out the homozygous, heterozygous, dominant, recessive. Good. So if a person has two big B's, they will have the dominant trait, which is brown eyes. It says right there on the top, brown eyes is dominant to blue eyes. Number two, if a person has two lowercase b's, yes, that is the only time that person will have blue eyes. And number three, if a person has one of each, one big, one small, Heterozygous, the dominant trait will still show because the big beam masks the small one. So that person will have brown eyes.